Welcome to the story. Have you ever done something, got in trouble for doing something your mom and dad told you not to do? Yeah, me too. Did they send you to your room, tell you to go stand in a corner, or maybe they sent you to your timeout place? Did you ever wonder if the punishment would ever end? If your mom and dad would love you again? Well, that's where we find ourselves in the story this week. Today in the story, God's people are being punished for their evil ways and for turning away from Him to worship other gods. You'll remember, because of Solomon's disobedience, God told him that his kingdom would be divided into two smaller and weaker kingdoms. The northern kingdom was called Israel, and it was made up of the 10 of the tribes of Israel. The southern kingdom was called Judah. It was made up of the tribes of Judah and Benjamin. Now, in the northern kingdom, not one king did what was pleasing to God. Not one. And because of that, they were taken captive by the Assyrians in 722 BC. They were interspersed with the foreign nations, never to be heard of again. It's where we get the thought of the 10 lost tribes of Israel. In the southern kingdom, though, of the 19 kings, only 5 of 19 did what was pleasing to the Lord. The other 14, they did evil in the sight of the Lord, and encouraged the people to do the same. And last week in the story, we were coming to the end of King Hezekiah's reign, in the beginning of his son Manasseh's reign. Now, King Hezekiah was one of the good kings, and he turned the people's hearts back to the following God, and it appeared that things had changed for good. But his son Manasseh was not at all like him. He was evil, unfaithful, and that all returned to the land. He did more evil than the people God had driven out of the land so Israel could possess it. Manasseh brought pagan worship idols into the temple. He worshiped openly other gods and even sacrificed his son to one of them. Isaiah the prophet declared that God's judgment was coming. Long before Babylon was a powerful nation, Isaiah told King Hezekiah that they would be the ones to take Judah captive. Now, Manasseh's son, Amon, was no better, and the evil continued. Ammon's son was Josiah. He was only 8 years old when he became king, and he was one of the good ones. He was king for 31 years and did what pleased God. He began to restore the temple when he was about 24, and that's when they found the book of the law that had been lost for many years. When Josiah read it, he began to tear down all the worship sites, the false worship sites, remove the idols from the worship centers. He was killed, though, in a battle with Pharaoh Necho of Egypt. He was followed by 5 evil kings, and finally the people were taken captive into exile by the Babylonians, just like Isaiah said. 2 prophets were prominent at this time: Jeremiah, who is left in Jerusalem to be with those who were left there, that kind of a remnant, and Ezekiel, who was taken into exile with the people. Well, let's look at those 2 prophets quickly. Jeremiah was 20 years old when God calls him to be a prophet to the nations. This happens in the 13th year of Josiah's reign as king. Jeremiah and Josiah have a good relationship. Jeremiah's call from God is significant and is recorded in the first chapter of the book that bears his name. If you look there in those verses 4 to 10, here's what we find. God saying to Jeremiah, "Before I formed you in your mother's womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I consecrated you. I appointed you to be a prophet to the nations." Jeremiah responds, "Lord, I can't speak. I'm too young." God says, "Don't be afraid. Just go where I send you and say what I tell you." Then God touches his lips and says, "See, I have put my words in your mouth." that Jeremiah sometimes is called the weeping prophet, because he was called to continue to remind the people of their evil and unfaithfulness. He was very much alone. Nobody wanted to be around him, and I'm sure that that message caused him great grief. With Josiah's reforms, you would think that Jeremiah would think that his preaching was doing some good. The trouble was, the people were practicing a fake religion. It looked really good on the outside, but their hearts were still far from God. When Josiah died, Jeremiah lost favor with the kings and was persecuted, but he remained faithful to God. Jeremiah wrote down his thoughts and his laments for the nation in 2 books of the Bible that we have, the one that bears his name, Jeremiah, and also Lamentations. Well, the second prophet was Ezekiel. Ezekiel's early years were spent in Jerusalem until he was taken captive with the others into exile into Babylon. God calls him to go to the rebellious people of Judah and to continue to remind them of the sins that brought them into exile. Whether they listen or not, Ezekiel was to preach that to them. Now, it was a woodshed message for the people of Judah. There was a punishment coming for their sins, and it would be severe. The Babylonians would come and conquer the land and take the people and destroy the temple. And see, for the Israelites, for those folks in Judah, the family name and the land was their identity. To lose it was major punishment, and that's what was coming. The northern tribes, they'd already lost their identity. They had been absorbed into the foreign nations, and the southern kingdom now feared a similar fate. It happened just as they had said, and the punishment was fulfilled. The people were taken into exile and would remain there for 70 years. It seems that God had sent his people into timeout. The prophets continued to remind them that they are getting what they deserve. But what about God's promise to David to have a ruler on the throne? Out of David's family would come the Messiah. How would God keep that promise? His promise with the people when they had been taken captive. Is there any hope for this people? Well, there is a word of hope. A word of hope comes. Amazingly enough, even as Jerusalem is being destroyed and its people carried off into captivity, words of hope and restoration are heard from the prophets. God's story is still alive. His purpose remains the same. God is pursuing a people to be his own. And although everything looks hopeless, the story is far from over. Ezekiel shares these words of hope with the captives. In chapter 36, he says these words, "For I will take you out of the nations. I will gather you from all the countries and bring you back to your own land. I will sprinkle clean water on you, and you will be clean. I will cleanse you from all of your impurities, from all your idols. I will give you a new heart and put a new spirit in you. I will remove from you your heart of stone and give you a heart of flesh. And I will put my spirit in you and move you to follow my decrees and to be careful to keep my laws. You will live in the land I gave your forefathers. You will be my people, and I will be your God." God's desire to restore his people is one theme that we see from the beginning to the end of the story. No matter how far away from him God's people were, he was always wanting and waiting for them to return. Now, for those who remained in Jerusalem, Jeremiah had these words. In chapter 31, Jeremiah writes this, "The time is coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah. It will not be like the covenant I made with their forefathers when I took them by the hand to lead them out of Egypt, because they broke my covenant. Though I was a husband to them, declares the Lord. This is the covenant I will make with the house of Israel after that time, declares the Lord. I will put my law in their minds and write it on their hearts. I will be their God, and they will be my people. No longer will a man teach his neighbor or a man his brother, saying, know the Lord, because they will all know me, from the least of them to the greatest, declares the Lord. For I will forgive their wickedness and will remember their sins no more. God will keep his promise through a new and better covenant. This new covenant is through his Son, Jesus, the promised Messiah. Through him, we will be cleansed. He will give us that new heart. His Spirit will live within us. We will dwell with him forever. It's through this new covenant that your story intersects with God's upper story. God's desires to restore his people, and that includes you. No matter what you've done, no matter how big a repeat offender you are, he is wanting and waiting for your return. Nearly 600 years before Jesus was born, these prophets have given us good news of a new covenant. By faith in Jesus, we can be cleansed of our sin, forgiven, and thus return to God. His Spirit will help us follow him, to honor and to worship him. No matter how hopeless or desperate your life seems to be, God is ready to receive you back to himself by faith in Jesus. This is God calling to those who are in time out. I love you. And now is the time to come out and enjoy my presence. There are consequences for rebelling against God. But God loves you and wants you to return by faith in him. And that's a story worth knowing and telling.